Well, good afternoon, everyone. We've had an opportunity here before you came in to have a dialogue with a group of folks who are doing really important work all over this city. These are some of the leading experts on how to combat domestic violence, and folks who have devoted their lives to overcoming this scourge. And we were taking the opportunity to talk about the strategies that this administration is trying to employ to fight domestic violence and the great work that these organizations are doing. And we also had the opportunity to hear from a very brave survivor, and we want to thank her, and I want to express my admiration for all you're doing to help other people and your willingness to speak publicly about what you have experienced. This is an issue, I don't need to tell anyone in this room, a fundamental challenge made more difficult by the stigma attached to it, by the fact that there hasn't been the kind of dialogue necessary in our society of how we stop this type of violence and how it is so fundamentally unacceptable in our city and must be treated that way. And every part of our city government, every part of our society have to unite in making clear that we will combat domestic violence in every conceivable way. That stigma stands in the way of people communicating about it and acknowledging it and helping us to understand how we can help. And it's something we have to overcome. In the room here with me, folks from our team who focus on this issue and have done a lot. I want to thank our Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services, Dr. Blasio, our Commissioner for the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence, Cecile Noel, and our Commissioner for the Human Resources Administration, Steve Banks. Also want to thank a key ally on this issue in the City Council, Councilmember Helen Rosenthal. And in a few moments, you'll hear from Councilmember Steve Levin, who's the chair of the General Welfare Committee, which has an oversight role in this area, and we thank you for your leadership as well. Domestic violence literally can tear apart the lives of so many people, and it is not just the individual who is attacked, it is so often their children too who feel the effects and whose lives are set on a very, very perilous course. And our job is to catch people and help them and protect them, and more to prevent domestic violence before it ever begins. The fact is, for so many families, and this is again an example of how far we still have to go, for so many families, domestic violence immediately means that the survivor, and often the survivor's children, become homeless. It's almost tragically automatic in so many cases because, of course, the survivor cannot stay in the same home as the batterer, and there often is no other alternative. So we want to be there in so many ways, again, to try and prevent this crisis to begin with, but also to catch people immediately if they find themselves suddenly in this kind of situation. There's a lot of tools we have. One that has worked very well is the Family Justice Center model. And this spring, New York City's 5th Family Justice Center will open in Staten Island, and we will have one in every borough. That's an important development because it's a place where all survivors know they can get legal help, counseling, and support in a variety of manners. The 4 existing Family Justice Centers, to give you an example of just how prevalent the problem is, the 4 existing Family Justice Centers saw nearly 59,000 client visits in 2015. And that's just talking about the people who knew about the Family Justice Centers and were willing to go there. That doesn't for a moment indicate the full extent of the problem, because there are so many people who were not able to or did not choose to go to a Family Justice Center. We've tried to create new tools to support people in need, including a rental assistance program called Living in Communities, or LINC, L-I-N-C is the acronym. And a portion of this rental assistance program has been designated exclusively for survivors of domestic violence and has helped 900 families so far. But there's so much more we need to do, and there are tools that are so effective that just aren't being used at this moment, and we need help. And an obvious example is the fact that survivor families could avoid having to end up in shelter to begin with, or if they end up in shelter, could get out of shelter more quickly if they qualified for the state's Family Eviction Prevention Supplement. That's known as FEPS, F-E-P-S. So there are so many people, if they qualified for FEPS, it would make all the difference for them. But they're excluded, and why? Because under the state's FEPS criteria, eligibility criteria, a family fleeing their home for their safety is not considered a family that's been evicted. So think about that for a moment. People who literally are in danger, maybe they didn't go through the traditional dynamic of eviction in their dealing with a landlord, but they're having the exact same outcome. They suddenly don't have a home, and on top of it, unlike so many other people who are sadly evicted, there's an element of real physical danger and urgency. The state should work with us to make sure that these families can qualify. And then on top of that, we have to acknowledge the reality of our housing market, which everyone knows has created more and more challenges as the cost of housing in the city has affected everyone in so many ways. But when it comes to the FEPS program, there's a fundamental problem, because even for people who get on the option of being a part of this initiative, the rent level is pegged at $1,050 per month, $1,050. And that's theoretically all that someone would have to be able to get an apartment. And that's a number that has not been increased for 10 years, for a full decade. So for so many people, that literally would not be enough to serve them and secure their family. Now, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has set a standard, and they call it the fair market rent, and they do this for each region of the country. For the New York City area, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development says that for a family to be able to afford an apartment of their own, they would need $1,515 per month. So that's their minimum standard, $1,515, almost $500 more than that which the state grants right now. So our federal government even recognizes the cost of housing here in New York City and what families in need would have to receive to be able to actually get to stable housing. But our state government has still not lived by the federal guidelines. If they did, if the state made this one change, over the next 5 years, we'd be able to help 8,300 families keep a roof over their head or get to an apartment and out of shelter. 8,300 families. And when you think about an average family size, that translates to about 25,000 New Yorkers. Think about that. Over 5 years, 25,000 New Yorkers could get to stable housing and get away from the dangers that they've faced if the state would make that one adjustment. You'll hear again from this impressive young woman who will talk about what it means to have that kind of support, what it would mean to have the kind of support that could help with stable housing. I also want to note that all of these good advocates, everyone here is not alone in this fight for fairness. The New York State Assembly and Speaker Carl Heastie have taken a major step by including in the one House budget passed recently the notion that this rent level should be adjusted and domestic violence survivors should be covered through the FEPS program. So I want to thank Speaker Heastie and the State Assembly for recognizing this as an urgent need and making it a priority in their budget. We need all our other colleagues in Albany to do the same. If the city and state work together, we can help thousands of families put their lives back together. Just a few words in Spanish. Estamos dedicados a apoyar a las víctimas de violencia doméstica como sea posible. Por eso, abrimos un nuevo centro de justicia familiar y creamos un nuevo programa para ayudar a los sobrevivientes a encontrar vivienda segura y económica. Esperamos que el Estado haga su parte para incluir a sobrevivientes en su programa de ayuda para alquileres y aumente la ayuda disponible para renta justa de mercado. I want you to hear from a leading advocate, and then I want you to hear a very personal story, and then I want you to hear from Chair Levin, and then we will take questions on this topic specifically. First, I want to introduce a great colleague in this work, President and CEO of the Urban Resource Institute, Nat Fields. Please, Nat.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, everyone. As the Mayor said, I'm Nathaniel Fields, President and CEO of Urban Resource Institute, and we've been in the community for over 30 years providing domestic violence services. But I'm also here in my capacity as the co-chair for the New York City Coalition of Domestic Violence Residential Providers. Every single licensed domestic violence shelter provider is part of our coalition. That said, I believe we are all here today, survivor of domestic violence, service providers, government and elected officials, because we understand the impact that domestic violence is having on our country, on our state, and our great city. For example, we know domestic violence can happen to anyone. But we also know that for women, domestic violence remains the leading cause of murder. This administration has been very, very active as a partner in really pushing back the scourge of domestic violence. So we want to thank the mayor for that and his team, Commissioner Stephen Banks and Commissioner Cecile Noel. They have pushed forward various options. It's very complicated as we work with survivors of domestic violence. As you've heard the mayor talk about, combining with the housing challenges in a fruitful market, it becomes even more challenging. So we need a variety of options to be able to offer survivors of domestic violence when fleeing a domestic violence relationship. Just in terms of some context, when a survivor makes a decision to leave a domestic violence relationship, they're at the highest level of danger. When you start to think about that and realize that despite the great efforts that we've made, right? You've heard the mayor talk about their resources from the New York City hotline, the Family Justice Center, police department is doing even more. When a person comes into shelter, they've left their community behind. They're in hiding. The goal here is to be able to help survivors leave shelter as quickly as possible. And while we have many options and some rent subsidies, when you look at the market today, it's very difficult for survivors to actually leave shelter because they can't find safe and affordable housing. So we're urging that we look at other options like FEPS that's more competitive in this market, so survivors who made a decision to leave everything behind can exit shelter as quickly as possible with their family, often in safe, affordable housing. So thank you for your attention to this matter.
Thank you very much, Nat. Now I want you to hear what it means to go through this challenge and then further have to struggle to find decent and permanent housing. And we want to thank you and welcome you and really appreciate you being a part of this. Move the microphone over so they can hear you okay.
No worries. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I am, as stated, a survivor of domestic violence. I'm in my late 30s. I'm the mother of 3 children, aged 19, 18, and 11. And currently, 2 of my children are residing in shelter with me, my oldest and my youngest. Unfortunately, my youngest son was witness to the incident that brought us there. In July, I had an altercation with my youngest brother, who has some issues, and in the following month, we were able to get into a safe place with myself and my children to transition for the next step. the process has been tedious, to say the least. I wanted to be extremely proactive in the process because I understand that this is an expensive market and it would take time to, come across something suitable. Using the programs provided to me now, I have come up against a lot of walls, and it's been a struggle. So I tried several methods. You go online, you look. Everybody has apartments. Every website will show you. You call, they'll tell you, no, we don't have that apartment available anymore. No, we don't take this program. No, call back. Reach out to us in a week, next month. I realized that method wasn't working. I opted for going into realtors' offices and saying, maybe if they meet me in person, and, I can win them over. Oh, we don't accept that. Sorry, we can't help you. We have a waiting list. And, a lot of discouraging feedback. Some of the more popular programs that are provided is what they're looking for. And FEPS being something that has existed for a much longer time, it's something they're familiar with, so they're a little more open to the idea of it. And I feel if I also had that option, it would alleviate some of my challenges I've come across in trying to, apartment search. Along with plenty of the young women that I speak with, it's the same conversation. How's it going? Have you heard anything yet? No, nothing yet. All right, well, if I hear something, I'll share it with you. If you hear something, share it with me. And just trying to get that conversation across to realtors and brokers it's a wall. And it's just one person coming to the broker. So he'll tell me, he'll tell her, her and her. But 10, 15, 100 women, you've told no, and now there's a group of people who have nowhere to go, and the time is elapsing, and it's a frustrating challenge while you're trying to get back to a place of normalcy, while you're trying to adjust and have a regular schedule, and even have an idea of, wait, where am I really going to live? While this is becoming slightly normal because this is my environment, I still need to get to a permanent place so I can really begin to heal and build from the past experiences. So it's been interesting. It's the most challenging because you want the healing to get to a completed place, or at least end living in it every day, because every day is a reminder. My son unfortunately had to see this incident, and he still deals with that in a very discouraging way at this point. If I discuss the conversation with him and remind him of the incident, I assure you there will be an incident that evening when he goes to bed. It's that kind of trauma. And getting back to a normal place where you go to your room and you go to your bed and your home are a part of the healing process. So it's not just the idea of being homeless. It's not just the idea of being a victim of domestic violence. It's the struggle of getting back to being just a human and trying to adjust to the normalcies that everybody else may or may not really consider in their day-to-day lives.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you very, very much. And I admire your strength, and you've got a lot of friends here. And we're going to stand by you.
Thank you. And please, if the FEPS becomes an option, let me know.
We're going to work hard to get that option for you.
I'm here for that. I'm here for that.
Thank you
Thank
very,
you.
very much. Well, again, I mentioned that the chairman of the General Welfare Committee, Steve Levin's done a lot to support survivors, and want to give you a chance to talk about this issue. Please, Chair Levin.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor. I want to thank you, your team, Deputy Mayor Blasio, Commissioner Banks, and Noel. I want to thank you so much for telling your story and for your strength and bravery. And I want to thank all of our providers here and advocates for making this a frontline issue. This administration in the last 2 years and change has shown real empathy for people in looking at this issue of the lives of survivors of domestic violence. They haven't just looked at the big picture, but they've also looked at what's going to make an impact in individual people's lives. And there's a lot of opportunity to make excuses in government, to not do anything. We know what the challenges are. We've been able to identify them for years. Advocates have identified the challenges. We've had many conversations or hearings, strenuous debate. We know what the challenges are. And all too often, government makes excuses for not acting. And this administration over the last couple of years has done the opposite. They've acted. I'll give you 3 examples. Creating the LINK programs, in the case of survivors of domestic violence, the LINK 3 program, creating the city FEPS program that has the city stepping in to where the state program was not meeting the need. The city went ahead under Commissioner Banks' leadership and created a brand new program to help address the needs of those families. Increasing the number of domestic violence beds in our shelter system. Those are just 3 examples of where we said action is needed, not words, not excuses, real action. And we're calling on the state to take that same approach, to increase the income or the reimbursement rate for the FEPS program, to allow for survivors of domestic violence to qualify without having to go into a homeless shelter. This is absolutely achievable. It takes, where there's a will, there's a way, and the time right now is for action and not excuses. I want to thank my colleague Helen Rosenthal, the chair of our Contracts Committee, for being such a strong advocate and for families, for survivors of domestic violence, and for effective government. And Mayor, thank you so much for convening this group and for exercising strong leadership on this issue.
Thank you very much, Steve. All right, we welcome questions on this topic. Yes.
Many times when women are in shelters, regular shelters, and they're being abused by their partner, they call DHS and ask see if there's a placement for a domestic violence bed in a domestic violence shelter. And a lot, they're told that there are no beds. Do you think that the city has a sufficient number of beds?
Well, I'll start by saying we obviously are trying to do all we can to accommodate everyone, but we also recognize that the goal should be upfront to prevent a situation where someone has no choice but to be in shelter. And that's why this opportunity to fix a broken policy and make FEPS available for domestic violence survivors and at a rent level that makes sense, that would be a more profound way of getting at the fact that people should not have to end up in shelter in so many cases. But in terms of the capacity we have, let me have Steve speak to that.
Well, I mean, certainly the problem is a complex problem and one that requires a comprehensive solution. And so the mayor has enabled us to put in place solutions to exactly the kind of problem that you're describing. So preventing people from having to remain in shelter for periods of time and occupy shelter beds that would otherwise be available for people who are fleeing for safety is a critical part of having the change made in the state FEPS program. It will allow the management of the state FEPS program to work as it should, which is to help survivors of domestic violence get out of shelter. Months ago, the mayor authorized us to implement a new program to add 700 shelter units, combination of Tier 2 units, 400 Tier 2 units, and 300 emergency beds. That's the total amount that was added between 2002 and 2010. So we're playing catch up to make up for many years in which the problem wasn't effectively addressed, and we've issued the kinds of requests for proposals. Some around this table have answered them. We've already got some beds up at Nathaniel Field's organization in relatively rapid time, although he'll be the first to say I called him pretty much every day to make sure we did that. But I think we're moving to address a very real problem, which you identified when you looked at the 2015 critical incidents reports, which reflected what I had seen for many years at the Legal Aid Society, which is the city wasn't adding new domestic violence beds, and now we are.
Questions? Yes.
So, city FEPS does include domestic violence victims, right? So is part of the problem here that the landlords are more comfortable and familiar with taking the state FEPS than any of the new city city programs that you put into place?
Well, actually, the problem with the City Fest program is the landlords are interested in it, but it's only a local social service district implementing a program to fill gaps in state policy. State FEPS is a program that was adopted in 2005 by the state in order to fulfill a statutory requirement to ensure that people could live in their homes.
He's being a lawyer. Let me try and get a translation going here. I think it was a very straightforward question. Are landlords more familiar with the state program and more willing to take it? Let's try that again, Steve.
Okay. I'm learning in government every day. Look, the landlords are familiar with state FEPS. It's been here for 10 years. All of the city programs are coming against the background of all of them being wiped out in 2011. So all of the landlords that we interact with remember 2011. And the state FEPS program, they know, is a program that's been here and will stay here. It's why it's so important to make this change in state policy to enable
the well. And, I can't blame someone who says, wait a minute, I was renting apartments, I was doing everything you told me to do, I had built, my assumptions on the idea this program was going to be around, and then one day I found out it was canceled. You can imagine what it meant for the recipients of the program who had been homeless and what it did to them. But even from the perspective of the people who owned the buildings, suddenly the rug was pulled out from under them. And they were cynical about government's commitment to this type of approach. So I literally had to bring people in from the real estate community to make a personal testimony. Obviously, at the time, I opposed the end of the Advantage program in 2011 in a different role I had then. And I said, look, I'm telling you this very personally. I thought it was wrong to cut it then. We've tried to create a whole set of new approaches that basically pick up where Advantage left off, where we want them to succeed, and we're going to be with them for the long haul. And as long as I'm here, we're going to keep doing this. I think for some of them that was compelling, but not for enough, especially in this kind of real estate environment. So I think the point, your question is right on the money. The tried and true initiative is the state one. They are continuing to take that. They are used to it. And that would really help us to serve people in need. Yes?
Has Cuomo or the state legislature been receptive to this idea?
Again, the Assembly went out of their way, to their credit, and Speaker Hasty, to put this in their one-house budget. So the Assembly really identified the kind of support that the state should be providing to help us address the homelessness challenge. And if you have witnessed the process of creating a one-house budget for either the Senate or the Assembly, it's a real statement of priorities. Lots of competing needs, but they make a decision about what they really care about. And they went out of their way to say that this is something that we need to do. We need to serve survivors, and we need to have the kind of rent levels that are pertinent using the HUD guidelines. So there's 3 elements in Albany, and one of them is present and accounted for. We need the other 2 now to join in. And look, I talked about this in my budget testimony back in February when I appeared before the Joint Committee in the legislature. I think it's been well documented in some of the correspondence that Commissioner Banks has had with the state, all of which has been public. So the question's been called, and then the Assembly, to their credit, made it very formal and said, let's do this right now. So it's time for action. Yes?
How much increasing the program to the levels you're looking for would cost, and in terms of how much that would just come to the city?
I'm going to start, and I'm going to save Commissioner Banks from himself by saying, at the beginning, help people understand the TANF reality and the fact that that does not directly cost the state.
It's so important to actually make this change because it would enable us to use federal money through the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families funding stream. The funding is provided to states like New York to provide this kind of assistance to keep families in their homes and keep them from becoming homeless or enable them to relocate to permanent housing. It's the basic federal funding stream. So the dollars cost is as follows. The city would have to pay $19.7 million, and we are willing to do so. The state would have to pay $8.3 million. And if we put in our 9.7 and the state puts in its 19.7, and the state puts in their 8.3, we will draw down $35.6 million in federal funds. Again, if we put in our $19.7 million, which we are willing to do, and the state puts in their $8.3 million, we will draw down $35.6 million in federal funds through the TANF program.
And that state TANF money that comes from the federal government, there's no strings attached to that money, right? The federal government doesn't require the state. The requirement is very general on how that's used. So the state has the power to use it for what you're suggesting, correct?
Yes, it does. As long as the funding is allocated to families that are eligible for the federal benefits, and all of the families that would be targeted here would be eligible for those federal benefits.
And for just one follow-on before you ask the next question, I have never met anyone, city, state, federal, who would say we shouldn't make a priority of helping survivors of domestic violence. So, you know, the TANF money comes to us from the federal government. The state has to make a set of priorities. I can't imagine a higher priority than this. Go ahead. Do you have a follow?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you know, this is just kind of a point of information for Commissioner Banks. I mean, how much of that TANF money in the state budget is allocated under the general kind of budget heading of other? Do you know? I mean, I know those pots of money tend to be pretty big, but they're not really specific as far as what they go to. Sorry, I know that's like very specific.
Get back.
I think you're on the right track.
Okay, that's a good answer. Yes.
Commissioner Banks, can you say anything after your meetings yesterday in Albany? Do you have a prognosis for being able to get this in the state's budget? Were they productive meetings? Any commitments from the GOP Senate majority side?
All of the conversations were productive. The message was very simple. We want to address homelessness in the city that's built up over years. In particular, we want to keep people in their homes so that more people can remain out of the system. We want to help survivors of domestic violence, and we want to help people move out of the shelters so that we can address the numbers of people that built up over a number of years. That's a very simple message. It was heard. It was received. The conversations were very productive.
But no commitment.
But obviously, the process is continuing, so no no commitments until the process is over.
Did you hear what were the arguments that you heard in opposition, if any?
I was asked for the facts. I provided the facts. They were productive, and again, no commitments until the process is over on the 1st.
Okay, last call. Is that a hand? I see a hand behind a photographer. Okay, we got to separate the photographer and the hand. There we go.
In what way were they productive, and what does productive mean?
Damn good question. I'm going to start. Steve can compose himself. I want to go back to the point I made about the assembly. Getting an issue like this that should have been resolved a long time ago onto the front burner is productive. So we really appreciate that the Assembly made a statement to the people of New York State and said this must be addressed, and it should be a priority in this budget to solve this. And survivors of domestic violence deserve this support. So the fact that it has been put on the front burner by the Assembly, and that Commissioner Banks is having conversations with the appropriate folks for the other elements of Albany, I think that's a sign of some progress because the issue is being enjoined. But again, we will tell you if we see something tangible. We have not gotten any tangible commitments yet. But I think it's important that the conversation is being had, especially at a time where there is still time to get it into the state budget.
I couldn't have said it any better.
Take notes, Steve. Okay, we good? Thanks, everyone.